caveman. Once you know all these things, you can sit back and start doing evolutionary psychology. Given these things that we know, given these theorems and precepts that we have been given, we can start making conclusions. People who go to the extra effort to punish free riders on behalf of the group are enforcement specialists. Their payoff is being liked and being rewarded by the group. People have a tendency to cooperate, even in the face of getting taken advantage of, because it's best to copy what the most successful people in your group are doing. The human brain, like a peacock's tail, has become enormous and costly due to its value as a sexually selected signal of male quality. And people who contribute generously and freely to group projects are rewarded because they are seen as valuable and desirable mates. These are all hypotheses which have to do with thinking about selection pressures, thinking about differential reproductive success, and how to process information in order to gain reproductive success. Okay? So now that that's all done, and we've got our conclusions, it's time to go home and take a hot bath. Our work as evolutionary psychologists is done. We've taken our precepts, we've made our conclusions, and it's time to go home. Okay? Fantastic. Which leads us to the criticisms. I have depicted the critic in a completely objective, fair, and non-pejorative type of a way. Stephen Jay Gould calls the entire field of evolutionary psychology a collection of just so stories. Other prominent critics, P.Z. Myers, researchers in this field produce some of the most awesomely trivial drivel. It is a teetering pyramid of stacked couldas and guesses that woulda had an influence on evolution. And whoop. Go back, Prezi. I object. If that is in fact where the evolutionary psychologists stopped, all of those criticisms would be valid. The idea is that if you theorize and you stop at theorizing, your conclusions are not falsifiable, you are not doing science. The fact is, among all of the wonderful and true things that evolutionary psychology has in fact told us, every one of the hypotheses that I just put forward to you have in fact been falsified by data. None of them were in fact the way we really think the world works. They were evolutionary, but they were misapplied, they were wrong, and they were not backed up by data. Evolutionary psychology, the work is only half done when you make a hypothesis. You have to go out and test it. It is a falsifiable area of inquiry because we are expecting modern humans to do things based on the kind of brain that we think evolution has given them. That design is still around today. So what do we do when we do research? We figure out what plausible cognitive mechanism would exist given evolutionary forces, what specific information in the ancestral environment that mechanism would have processed, how it processes it to lead to reproductive success, and how can we test that in the modern day. Here's a good example from Deb Lieberman, who is now working in Miami, worked also in Hawaii, and came from Santa Barbara. Deb says, what ancestral information do we use as modern human beings to detect kin in our environment? Do we use DNA test reports? We do now. They're wonderful, they're cheap, and this is mine. Well, not mine, but my son's. Okay? This is information that we have available to us in the modern day. It is not information that we had available to us ancestrally. So we are not going to have an adaptation that is specifically designed for looking at a DNA test and reading the 99.99999% probability that I do in fact have a son named Kurt. Okay? Why did you do it? Because I'm an evolutionary psychologist. Don't even ask. Okay? No more nefarious reason than that. This is information that we do not have access to, so we were hypothesizing an adaptation that would operate over different kind of information. The primary source of information that we would get about who our kin are is called maternal perinatal association. If you see your mother caring for an infant, that is a sibling. If you do not have maternal perinatal association available to you, you will fall back on another cue, which is co-residence. How long have I spent in the same household with someone? And that will tell me whether or not that person is likely to be a sibling. A tertiary cue is culture. What you've been told, what you believe, the cultural info about who your relatives actually are. The evolutionary psychologist has hypothesized maternal perinatal association is an extraordinarily good cue. It should be the first cue, and if that cue is available, that should be the end of the story. If that cue is not available, we fall back onto the other two. How could we find this out? You test undergraduate introductory psychology subjects. You ask yourself, once you figure out who your kin are, what would you do with that information? The answer is twofold. You would avoid incest. If you figure out who your kin are, those are the people that you're motivated not to touch that way. You would also engage in kin altruism. These are the people with whom you would be willing to share your car, some money, or a kidney. Okay? Two things that you do once you figure out who your kin are. And so, Deb gave people questionnaires, gave people some covert observations, gave people a whole bunch of battery of tests, and asked them about these things. And the results were in line with the predictions. Older siblings, people who had maternal perinatal association information available for assessing the siblinghood of their younger siblings, used it. When MPA was available, they were quite disgusted by suggestions of incestuous activity with their younger siblings, and they were quite generous to them in real life and in intention, and it did not matter how long they had lived together as children. However, for younger siblings who did not have the chance to observe their older siblings being nursed or cared for by their mothers, they regulated the amount of disgust and thoughts of incest and the amount to which they would be generous to their siblings based on how long they had spent in the household with that sibling. There was a positive relationship between those two variables. It was strong. I forgot the effect size. I apologize. Belief that your sibling is your sibling, the degree to which you would strongly agree, I'm sure this person is my brother, explained no variance in the data. Or at least the effect was so small that it was not significant in this particular data set. So the traditional explanation, we avoid incest because there's a cultural taboo on it, seems to be a relatively lame explanation given the data. Okay? That's one good example. Here's another one from modern day, which has been hotly contested on one of my favorite websites, Slate Magazine. Petrali and Gallup in 2002 did a study by which they investigated one of, now this is a nice cottage industry, everybody's investigating menstrual cycles and changes in women across the menstrual cycle and fertility and ovulation. What they found was that the grip strength of women increased when they were ovulating, when they were reading a story about being potentially raped and being stalked and grabbed from behind in the parking lot. Women who were not ovulating or who were contracepting, taking oral contraceptives, did not show this increase in grip strength when reading the story about rape. And women who read a control story, that was a story but it wasn't about rape, also did not show this increase in hand grip strength. What is the evolutionary explanation? Well, the theorists doing the work thought, they have psych interpretation, we have a female adaptation for sexual assault prevention when that sexual assault prevention would have had the greatest genetic payoff. It is most important, it is always important for you to prevent sexual assault, but in reproductive terms, it is most important for you to prevent sexual assault when it could result in a conception. And so we have a mechanism that will give you superhuman strength, or at least slightly more than average human strength, during those periods of time where it would pay off the most. Reasonable, logical, evolutionary psych explanation. However, the critics are very upset about this. It takes more than a small study on American college women at a single school to convince me that a behavior is an evolved adaptation to prevent rape. Okay, sorry. Here's the counter-objection. Is it plausible? And this comes to the complexity of the explanation involved. Which explanation of the data, given that the data is actually true, that's a given we're going to have to accept, that they weren't making up the data, okay? If the data is actually true, what is the most likely explanation? That we have an adaptation for rape prevention, or that there's really something special about these hundreds of women at the University of New York, SUNY Albany. These undergraduate women, did they go to the right prep school? Did they drink the right kind of water? Did they take a rape prevention when ovulating by grip strength class? That taught them culturally to get stronger when they read a story about potential rape, but only do so when ovulating. Is that a good explanation? Is it also a good explanation that this stuff happened? For no good reason, just because. It's complexity that didn't have any reason behind it. Okay? That's a counter-adaptationist explanation. Could it have been random error in the data? Well, we've got a p-value. Thank you, 300 students, for showing up. Is this good science to refuse to believe the interpretation? Well, you got to go with the most basic and most reasonable explanation for the data that you have. And so I would say that, it's good to be doubtful, it's good to be critical, but if the most reasonable explanation, the simplest Occam's razor-esque explanation is an evolutionary adaptation, you must consider the possibility that just might have an outside chance of being true. Here's the final quote from that exchange online that I kind of like right now. When other scientists put forward a model of how the world works, it's called a theory. When an evolutionary psychologist does it, it's called storytelling. It's a model. We don't know if it's true until we go out and test it. If we test it and it turns out to be true, thank you, scientist, you've done good science. If you leave it as a hypothesis without testing, you haven't done good science. Go home. Any field can be guilty of storytelling if they don't gather empirical data. Okay? Evolutionary psychologist is no different. Psychology is no different. You can do bad ev psych. Dear God, I've seen a lot of it. You can do good ev psych if you are a careful scientist, just like anybody else. And so the question, can it be careful science? It can be, but just like anything else, tain't necessarily so. And I do have thanks for the people who were contributing to my ideas here. Jesse Beering was the author of that article on Slate that I kind of referenced heavily for quotes from Coyne and P.Z. Myers. Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, and everybody at the Center for Evolutionary Psychology who poisoned my mind over 7 years with an affirmation of these beliefs. And especially psychos here represented by the Pub Crawl Freud t-shirt logo. We need a logo, hardcore. And Psychi, and especially Terry, who got this whole thing off the ground. It was a wonderful opportunity. Thanks.